Hi everyone, welcome to the February 2nd edition of the TimeformUS forecast. I'm David Aragona, and this week we're going to be looking ahead to Saturday's Pick-5 sequence at Santa Anita. They've got 4 graded stakes scheduled on this Saturday card. 2 of those are part of this Pick-5 sequence, both the Grade 2 Santa Monica and the Grade 3 Thunder Road. They are the final 2 races of the day. But we've also got a couple of interesting maiden races, an allowance race that kicks off the sequence. Definitely not easy handicapping. I was kind of going back and forth between what sequence I wanted to handicap on the podcast this week. I know a lot of eyes will probably be on Gulfstream Park with them running the Holy Bull, a few other graded stakes, and that high-profile allowance race, but just thought the Santa Anita sequence looked a little deeper, more interesting, some different things to discuss, and as I went through and handicapped it, definitely not the easiest ticket to put together. Now, my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski is still not available this week. He's kind of doing some double duty with the speed figures, filling in for his assistant, so he's going to be back next week, I think, is what we expect. But I'm happy to have a guest back on the podcast today, Emily Gullikson, who we've had a few times in the past, will be returning. Emily, of course, of Optics EQ, and now a racing analyst at Hawthorne. Emily, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, David, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, always enjoy talking to you, and you are somebody who does follow the California circuit, I know, most of the year, so hopefully you can provide some insights into this card. I'm somebody who's not always focused on California, but I do enjoy handicapping these cards because they can put together some good sequences on Saturday, and I like the way that they structured the sequence, kind of taking some of the less interesting stakes races out, and definitely makes this not the easiest ticket to put together on Saturday.
Yeah, it's a competitive sequence of races and spots that you can really kind of get creative, and I know you put in the work, and I'm glad you kind of chose this sequence, and also from like just kind of that selection standpoint, because right before we hit record it was like this one or Gulfstream, and I think for the most part people would lean Gulfstream because it has those stakes races, so it's like, oh, we're stakes races, we have to automatically like get into it, but it's like it's about good racing and betting. And so, wherever those races kind of come up, right? So as you mentioned, like I'm at Hawthorne, we don't have a lot of the stakes races. So people are asking like, how is the racing there? It's like, we are who we are. These are competitive races. They're good races to bet. There's opportunities for players to play. And like, I love that, like I'm at home following a circuit, and if there's competitive races, whether it's, N2 claimers, maiden claiming, state breds, like I'm all about it, getting those competitive sequences. So I'm looking forward to this sequence and talking through it with you, somebody that I obviously respect your opinion, your work ethic, and just always a chance to talk about racing and, learn something and pick something up along the way.
Well, you're very kind, and I feel the same about you. That's why I keep asking you back on this podcast. I know that people enjoy hearing from your perspective because you really do bring a unique viewpoint to a lot of these sequences and just your way of assessing value. And speaking of that, I just wanted to ask you a little bit. You are doing some work for Hawthorne now, and I know that's changed since we last spoke. So just talk a little bit about that. I know recently you've been doing some live shows where you're kind of assessing value in real time with your co-host, Jim. So just talk a little bit about how that's been going and where people can find that.
Yeah, so that's every Friday, and it's on YouTube right now. So you can find that if you follow Hawthorne Racecourse on YouTube, subscribe, and then you can hit the follow. And it's an ongoing every Friday. So it's it'd be 1:00 Eastern time, and we go for about an hour and end up covering 5-6 races. It's usually like the first couple from, 2 races from, I won't say the first couple, but a couple races from Aqueduct, a couple races from Tampa, a couple races from Gulfstream. But we're playing them in real time, and so it starts to kind of get people thinking, because I know when we're doing this handicapping right now, there's so much information that we don't have, right? We're going to have to assume the public's going to gravitate, make maybe this horse the favorite. We're going to also assume that there won't be a single scratch throughout the sequence, so it's like, for people that are assessing pace and you're assessing these races as a whole, a scratch or two could completely change the outcome. And so doing the show live, we're able to look at those factors in real time, starting from the public is making this horse the favorite. Is this horse a good favorite? Can we look at this horse and start to find knocks in it? And if we can, go outside, or if not, and it's a legitimate favorite, how do you play those type of sequences, right? And just kind of thinking that way, and I don't think there's enough content that's going there, and it's hard content to do because you're when you start to separate the handicapping from the betting, it's not even really like it's the next step. It's like the next like 40 or 50 steps. Maybe it's a mile away because they're just, there's so much separation of those two. And it's something like I've had to learn, and I'm still learning, and I'm still kind of challenging myself to like bring myself more into like the gambling horse player and away from the handicapping, just pick a winner.
Yeah, I love that you framed it that way, and I've watched a little bit, and that's definitely what comes through, because a lot of the live racing broadcasts that we do see, and this is not a knock on them, it's just the way that I think a lot of the producers of these shows think about them, is they have handicappers on that are already giving out picks earlier in the day, or they do other types of analysis shows ahead of time before wagering begins, and they're kind of married to those picks, and when it comes time to assess value before the race is run, you kind of have to reassess to see, well, are the horses that I picked 24 or 48 hours ago taking the amount of money that I thought? Is this really still the value play that I thought it was going to be? And what I like that you're trying to do is kind of get rid of that whole component of, well, I have to kind of backtrack and, make a case for the horse that I picked a long time ago and just see, okay, well, this is what the board is telling me, and what's the right way to play based on the situation that I'm presented with 10 minutes to post.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm like a pain in the butt to the production staff that way because they are kind of married to that format as well, as far as like, well, who do you like in this race so we can put up a graphic? And I'm like, I'm not doing that because I don't we're able to play live. That's the benefit of it, is I'm not going to give you three picks that when that board comes up or when I look at the first race, yeah, my initial assessment might be at, 1, 2, 3. Now all of a sudden I'm 4, 5, 6, and I want to look at 4, 5, 6. Or maybe I thought the 1 was my top pick, but that horse, I don't like the way it looks on the track. It's, wearing front wraps the first time, whatever that is, and it's not a horse I would ever play at this point, right? But going through your initial assessment, so I've been, I've been kind of like stubborn in that of like I want to do something different. I want to break away from that kind of traditional mold and kind of do something that is a little bit more the way that we should be challenging ourselves as players and as gamblers.
I think it's a really great thing to preach because horse players don't have those handicaps where they have to make picks ahead of time. They have to be nimble. They have to adapt in the moment. So having experts like you kind of give them strategies or instruct them on how to do that, I think is pretty helpful. So I would hope people can tune in and see some of the work Emily's been doing. It's pretty cool. Well, Emily, let's dive into this Pick-5 sequence because there's certainly a lot to talk about. And, we've been discussing assessing value in real time. Well, you can't really do that in most legs of a Pick-5 sequence. So we kind of remove that element of it a little bit. Perhaps we'll talk about some of these races from, an intra-race standpoint, if there's a good win or exacted bet, that kind of thing. But when you're playing a Pick-5 sequence, you do kind of have to do your own work ahead of time and assess where you think the value is going to be because you're constructing a ticket for races that you're not going to be able to see the win wagering for 4 out of the 5 legs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that the way that this sets up is kind of good in this first leg because you could go a couple different ways in here, and it does kind of start with like, in my opinion, where the public is going to gravitate to, because a lot of these horses, if you're looking at them on paper, regardless of what past performance provider you had, they almost look identical, right? Like there's just not a lot of separation. So you're like, okay, well, the public has to go somewhere. So it seems like, in my opinion, they're going to gravitate towards the 10 because the 10 kind of looks safe, right? It's like you have these connections, Pratt, D'Amato, the horse is coming off 2 wins. They really, the turf racing is good. Like all those things are positives, right? And so if they're going there, and as I said before, there's not a lot of overall separation. A lot of these horses look the same. So why are you taking necessarily a short price that everybody's going to gravitate towards? This is kind of going back to the Pegasus last week when you have some alternatives in this field, right? So you start digging a little bit deeper on the 10. Okay, it's a maybe coming off a slight freshening, that 49-day break. This is the first start they're going to be taking on open company. A lot of the trips have been favorable. If I'm looking at optics figure range, which is kind of a race par, she's been running in pars that are much lower than today, right? So you really start to pick apart these horses, and it's like, okay, if the 10 is the horse, and I'm assuming that this is the horse that people are going to gravitate towards, I don't know for sure, that opens the race up to some other ways to go in that opening leg and could be a spot to kind of find some separation.
Yeah, we were viewing the 10 in a similar fashion here. I agree. I mean, we haven't seen the morning lines for this day yet, but I would imagine that the 10 will be the favorite and just seems like the kind of horse that, as you said, is the safe option for the public for all the reasons that you outlined. And this horse seems almost equi-talented on dirt and turf, maybe a little bit better on the turf. But when I watch Carmen Miranda's turf races, I'm not noticing a ton of finish there. She's hung a couple of times. Yes, her speed figures, I suppose, put her in the mix, but you were mentioning the class a little bit. I'm looking at the TimeformUS PPs, and I see the exact same thing. A lot of the race ratings, which is like a class rating of her races, are a little bit lower than the projected rating for today's race. So, as the likely favorite, and especially given the fact that she's drawn all the way outside in this 10 post, which I think is a difficult position, especially for a horse that wants to be somewhat forward, maybe she's one that you want to take a little bit of a stand against. And also, Phil D'Amato and Flavien Prat, I mean, connections that are going to take a lot of money, but maybe you can lend some insight into this. Flavien Prat is not having the Santa Anita meet that a lot of people might have expected.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's probably pretty obvious, but also, riders go through cycles, barns go through cycles. We see this a lot, like, Phil D'Amato as well, and it's like these are still people that are professionals that know what they're doing, right? So it's at any point that could turn around. So I'm not as concerned, except when you are dealing with a short price, it can be a knock. But I think at this point, everybody's kind of already caught on to that trend a little bit. But yeah, maybe during another point in time, that would kind of reduce the odds even a little bit further.
Well, getting away from Carmen Miranda, I think we do have to talk a little bit about the pace of this race because for a 6 furlong sprint, I just don't see any confirmed front runners in this field. There are some horses that have shown good tactical speed in the past, but it does feel like it really is going to be a jockey's race as to who decides to go to the lead. And that could hurt a few horses in here that I was trying to make cases for that are deeper closing types. Like, I was somewhat interested in the number 5, Rivendell, a horse that, if you go back through her New York form from 2021 and early 2022 when she ran at Gulfstream, she faced some really good horses that have ended up in stakes since then, like Too Sexy, High Opinion, Love and Thunder, and Messidor, all horses that have placed in graded stakes in New York. But she's been off for a long time, coming back for the Neil Drysdale barn. I thought her recent workouts look okay, like she might be doing well for this, but it just feels like she might not get the pace setup that she needs.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the pace. It is really it's a tough read, and it will. I agree with you. Come down to a rider's race because, well, a lot of times you see those race. It's like it could go one of two ways, right? Somebody decides to clear, and then that's it, right? That's game over right there. They just go wire to wire, or you get a lot of these riders that are like, I'm gonna push, and the pace doesn't necessarily become fast, but you get all these horses kind of bunching up, and then it sets up for this horse that's like saving ground and just happens to land in the right place at right time. So I had a hard time assessing the pace. So it was one of those kind of handicapping factors that I started to kind of downgrade a little bit more, right? Because and that's what another puzzle to this opening race, because speed figure wise, you can make the case for many as far as class. Rivendell is certainly one I looked at because it's a new face and coming in from New York, where you mentioned was facing much better and certainly has the numbers and probably seems maybe the right circuit for her as far as getting that 6 furlong sprint where you're not necessarily going to have that certainly at Gulfstream this time of year. Um, so a couple horses that, and I'm not against the 5 Rivendell in any ways, but kind of looking sort of away from pace since it's a factor that I can't get to. I looked at Annie's. Well, I guess maybe this does kind of draw into pace, but Annie's song is one that has some tactical speed. And she's an interesting horse because this is always a horse that I felt like this is a one-turn horse. And you go through her form, and it's like they had her running long for so long, then they cut her back, and it's like. Thank you. You know, she did what she's supposed to do. This is what she wants, right? And so then Sadler claimed her, runs are long, right? So I can excuse that race at Del Mar. Then also again running long in the second start for the barn, and then coming back at Del Mar in November. And this is again just kind of knowing a circuit. Sadler was extremely cold that meet, so I can look at every one of those races since she's been in the Sadler barn and kind of draw lines through them, and then you can get a little bit more into the weeds as far as the trip and the post and whatnot. But just generally speaking, like if you remove those three races and then you just look at her sprint races, you're like, this horse fits. And she's got tactical speed. And there's a rider up that's, an apprentice rider that's probably, at least with the plan, is going to be aggressive. So that's one of the horses that I'm using in here for kind of those angles.
Yeah, she's probably the horse that I spent the most time looking at in this race because, like you said, it's kind of hard to figure out who she is. And I did tend to agree that she's more of a sprinter, even though she didn't run that well last time. But I guess my concern with the last race at Del Mar was after routing so much, has she lost that early speed that she had early in her career? Because she broke a little bit slowly last time, and it also seemed like April Cedillo just wasn't that interested in going forward from an outside post. But still, she just wasn't really trying to go forward at any point in that race. And she was running on at the end, 6 furlongs at Santa Anita, obviously different than 5 furlongs at Del Mar. So I wouldn't want to see her towards the back of the pack. But if she can get forward in this race, I agree. She's one that could be
Yeah,
dangerous in here.
my whole thing is just I just excuse that race altogether because of the barn was just so cold. It's like nothing from that barn was running. So why would this one? You know what I mean? And so yeah, I mean again, you can kind of make it the trend, but I think it was more of like just more of the trend at that time that allowed me to give that race a pass because as far as trip, if you go back and watch, there's to your point, there's not much excuse and you would want to see a little bit more.
Now, I want to get your take on a couple of other horses, and maybe there are more that you want to talk about, but I'll bring them up right now,
Yes.
and then you can kind of wrap up this race by mentioning everybody that you want to use. As a trip handicapper, obviously the number 8, Pearl Glory, stands out a little bit, just watching all of their last races. She is one that really did have some trouble. She was towards the back of the pack early, just didn't really have a place to go in this stretch, and probably could have done better than her 7th place finish first time in this country. But she is a horse that clearly does not have that much early speed. And I know you don't want to harp on the pace too much because it is pretty murky, but she does feel like one that's going to be out the back door early. So she's going to have to work out some kind of trip if they're not moving that quickly up front. And also, you mentioned maybe a horse in this race can just save ground on the rail and end up sitting the right trip, even if they don't look like the best one on paper. And perhaps the number 1, Ready Jet Go, could be that kind of candidate. I wouldn't say that I love any of her races, but she's a horse that typically doesn't take that much money due to connections, although these connections actually do just fine. And her last couple of races, they've been okay. She's coming off a brief freshening. She's got the tactical speed to get into that stalking position, saving ground. So I'm not going to be surprised when she outruns her odds once again.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it just goes back to the point of like if you're going to take a stand against the 10, we're just and for conversation's sake, we're assuming that's going to be the favorite. You can start making cases for these horses that are fourth, fifth best in the race that maybe they just fall in the right place in time because your real opinion is you're trying to go outside the 10. Now, as far as the 8, definitely one I want to bring up because the trip absolutely had that trip back on September 4th. Another barn that was cold at the time at Del Mar wasn't a good ride from a physical standpoint. She's on the smaller side. It was expecting her to cut back. She did gallop out well. I thought the race was like a perfect prep. So now this comes so now it's the knock, right? Because it's like okay, that race, if that race was going to be a prep, it's towards the end of that Del Mar summer meet. So you think they're, looking at Santa Anita, some of these one turn sprints, but then she's disappeared, right? And she's been off 153 days. Now, the problem that I have with that is not only just the layoff, because you could say, okay, maybe an issue popped up and they needed some time, but she's been working consistently since October. Like, what are you waiting for? Because they've been running here for like 2 months, you know, not maybe quite 2 months, but fairly close. So the layoff concerned me in this case because it's like this is a horse I was expecting gets the race in the country, time when the barn's cold. They're going to give her that race, come to Santa Anita, cut her back, win. And now it's like, oh, we've got the layoff. She's been working all this time. Uh, you already have the race to get her fit, so it's like there's not really fitness. So that's just what concerns me is that layoff in there, because had they have come back in like 45 days, 35 days, whatever, uh, that this horse that'd be the single, we'd be moving on. Now her stablemate, Rebel Girl, probably not something Craig would ever ask you, but do you listen to Bikini Kill?
Uh, I know of Bikini Kill. I don't listen often.
To catch you off guard. So a life-changing band for me. I don't know if it'll be a life-changing score this day, but we could possibly. But looking at her form can really kind of get creative. So that first start, there was some slight issues in there as far as trouble, but kind of more than that is maybe it was a prep for the summer, just kind of the timing and looking at Del Mar, and they go to Santa Rosa, and that Santa Rosa race was like very good. Very good race, winning race for the level. Granted, it's Santa Rosa, but again, Powell being a little bit cold. As far as that October 10th race, that race earned a solid speed figure. And I know it doesn't necessarily jump off the page because of the finishing position, but she was wide up close to a fast pace. The top two finishers came from off the pace that day, and she was wide, which if you're chasing wide, you kind of follow trips. You just know, especially if you're wide up close to a solid pace, probably not a day you're going to run very well. And so she ran a good figure. Then she came back and just a quick turnaround in 20 days and actually improved her speed figure in that second place finish. And it was an open length pace setting winner that she ran behind on October 30th. So she's like got those trips, and then she comes back and wins. But it's like she's been sitting on that race. So if you're really looking at her, she has not done anything wrong at this point. And she's probably going to be overlooked. Now, she does have to step up because she's taking on winners for the first time. But again, she's run well. She has numbers on par. She now has recency. She's making the second start off the layoff. She has a little bit more tactical speed because she's getting a little bit more ground. She has been tactical in the past. So certainly a horse I'm going to use from a band that I've loved since I was a young teen.
Well, I'm glad you brought her up because she's one that I was kind of on the fence about, and I think you make the right kind of case for her. She is one of the few horses in this race that has that upside where we kind of know what a lot of these other horses are. I'm not expecting a big step forward for most of them. And, I was looking at some stats in this race. The only one that really jumped out of me was for Rebel Girl. Leonard Powell has great stats off maiden wins. He's 8 for 33, 272 ROI over the past 5 years. So she's definitely one that I could make the case for. And I think you very eloquently stated the reasons to like her. So we'll see if she's the right kind of price to include in this first race. Can we move on? Is there anybody else you want to talk about in here? I know we could probably make a case for almost every horse in this field, but
yeah, exactly. The only other one I would just kind of mention, because I think people maybe gravitate towards there, is number 3, Briefcase Girl, who I'm not necessarily against, but another one that could be short. Needed to see a little bit more from her last out, but another one that has some tactical speed, and Gaines could have a couple live runners on there. But yes, I'm ready to move on.
Well, it doesn't get too much easier as we proceed on to the 7th race. It's a maiden optional claiming for horses that sold at auction for $150,000 or less. They don't have to be in for the tag. Otherwise, I think horses are in for the $62,500 down to $50,000 tag in here. So I think this is a question of whether or not you trust the number 1 Arrow the Great coming off the layoff, because clearly this horse ran pretty well on debut, actually finished right in between two horses that we're going to see in the Robert B. Lewis earlier in the day, Newgate and Hard to Figure. But that was all the way back in July at Del Mar. Watching that race back did feel like the kind of horse that's supposed to get better with added ground and also with some experience, was kind of hanging on his wrong lead early, didn't break that sharply, galloped out well once he switched over to his right lead. Coming off a long layoff, though, for Dan Blacker, what do you expect from this guy? And is he the kind of horse that you would lean on here, or do you view this as another totally wide open race?
Um, there's a lot of questions there. As far as as far as this horse as an individual, I think sort of the same way as I think that this horse is probably a horse that's going to be used pretty heavily for those reasons, right? Then you start getting into these questions, right? Like if he ran so well against maiden special weight runners, like why wouldn't they run him back at that level, especially, with the higher purses and those horses, in stakes company. But they're here, they're going to make changes, like the blinkers are off and Lasix, and there was a little bit of race flow going on, kind of had that fast pace while it was a little bit green. So again, it's not a horse I'm against in this race, but I took sort of a kind of a different approach. And I wrote up, we might talk about some of these Derby preps, but if not, I wrote about the Holy Bull, which is on the Hawthorne site. And the reason I bring this up is because it's not even so. I wrote about the race, but I wrote about it as far as a handicapping kind of technique, because you have half the field that's coming out of the Mucho Macho Man stakes. And so that strategy is the way I kind of looked at this race, right? Because you have that group of horses that are coming out of the common race on January 6th, that made an optional claiming race, which is under similar conditions to today. So I sort of like, because this race is just kind of like you stare at it and you're like, ugh, what do I want to do with those horses? Am I going to look for the winner out of that group, or am I going to look for a new face, right? So, going back and like, of those horses, like which one would I want? And I'm going to make the decision, and maybe it's the wrong one, but I'm going to make the decision that I'm not going to take a horse out of that race. So then it separates the field to where, well, Arrow the Great is not out of that race. So it's probably one I'm going to use. But that was sort of like my kind of approach, that I'm not going to sink everything into this horse, especially because he has been a little bit green. He has been off. He has the rail. If he's going to close, it's not like Vicar Espinosa has been riding all that great this year. Things that, like, when you're talking about a short price and maybe in a race that people will gravitate towards this horse, not wanting to want anyone else. I'm going to use some others, but I'm not super against this horse, but I'm not in love with him in this spot either.
Yeah, I actually really like the way that you framed that with regard to the Knoll Arbor race that a lot of these horses are coming out of. I kind of struggled with that same question, if I wanted anybody out of there. It's funny. It feels like in a lot of these situations, connections are taking advantage of this new condition to get away from the Bob Baffert horses, because as we know, Bob Baffert has run close to 100% of the maiden special weight races that have been run in California for this current 3-year-old crop. So maybe that's one of the reasons why a horse like Arrow the Great is not running back at maiden special weight, just to kind of find this easier spot that the connections know that he's eligible for. He doesn't have to be in for the tag. I mean, he can, satisfy this auction condition. Unfortunately, those horses that ran in the Knoll Arbor race, they ran into a Bob Baffert horse that didn't even look that formidable in Knoll Arbor, and he crushed them. So, I mean, it just goes that way sometimes. You brought up the post for Arrow the Great, and normally I don't like to get too caught up in post positions, but I do think it's relevant for this horse, because in that debut race, he was outside, kind of got to stay out of the kickback the entire way and, find his feet while not having to deal with, navigating horses that were tiring in his face. And this time, as a horse that didn't show that much speed on debut, you worry a little bit that he's going to have to deal with that kickback for the first time, racing down on the inside. The positive is, I watched the recent workout that's available. I think it was from January 21st. He worked with a horse, Burn in Turf, for these connections, who is a graded stakes horse on the turf. And I actually really liked the way he was going with that horse. To me, visually, it was an improvement from what I saw from him last year for Arrow the Great. So it feels like a horse that actually might be doing okay, and maybe they just chose this spot for the reasons I stated. No Baffert's in here. So we'll see. I think he's the most likely winner, but I didn't want to put all my eggs in that basket. There are a couple others in here that I want to to mention. And I think once again, this is one of these races where it's hard to figure out the pace. They're lightly raced horses. Most of them haven't been sent to the front end in their prior races. Maybe that makes a horse like the number 9, Bluegrass Go-Go, a little bit interesting, because he is a horse that has tried to show speed in some faster paced races, like last time in that dirt race where Faustin closed to win. And this is just a significant drop in class for him.
Absolutely, and I thought the same thing. Like this, for all those reasons, is he hasn't been super fast, but he's drawn outside. He has Maldonado, so typically you think they're going to send. They've been sitting up close to fast paces. The class relief alone, so at least you have the intent that you're going to get a horse that's out in front in a field that where most of these horses have had the tendency to break slow. So getting out in front, O'Neill's been sending out some live horses, and there really hasn't been much intent for Bluegrass Go-Go in either of those starts. I mean, he had some trouble on debut, but there really wasn't much intention. He was 6-1 morning line, didn't take much money that day. And then, as you mentioned, caught the Baffert horses on opening day. So both those races, he hasn't really been in the right spot to show run. And if he does have run, this should be the right spot. And if he's good enough, so 100% a horse I'm going to use.
Yeah, and I'm a little bit unsure about his overall ability, but I will say his PPs look a lot like Noel Arbor's did coming into that same race for this condition last time, just getting that big class relief, and it can make a big difference for a horse that's able to get in front of his rivals for the first time. Sometimes they get a little bit brave. Who else are you looking at in this race? I know you said you want to kind of stay away from those horses coming out of that common January 6th race. Is there anybody else that caught your eye that's coming from a different direction?
Yeah. So that just kind of upgrades those other horses. So Glad has two runners in here, and Street Mogul, you could kind of make the same sort of case as Bluegrass Go-Go, just in terms of the class drop. It's a second start going back to December 31st. It was raining during the race, and so I don't know if maybe a lot of the connections in that race were kind of thinking the races were going to come off the turf, and they ended up not. And just kind of a horse that looks just physically on the cheaper side, and watching his works, he's like a little bit plotty. So he's certainly not on the special weight level. A horse I wanted to see more from. Now, as far as the stablemate number 6, Soldatna, I'm going to guess that's how you say it. It's a horse that debuted at Emerald Downs, coming off the layoff, so making a first start in the circuit, which we know kind of has that ship and win bonus. Eligible. Now, going back to that race, it was a horse that was seemed like there was some intent there. He was bet down from the 8-1 morning line, showed some run, broke a little bit slow, but kind of made that inside move, and then lacked a lead change. So when I watched his works, that was one of the things that I really wanted to see, is just, have they been able to get this horse to change leads, which they have been able to in the morning. So I'm a little bit more interested in the 6 than the 7, but again, since I'm kind of spreading a little bit. But as far as number 5, Look Sharp, it's a first-time starter in here that I'm going to use. It's a Tim Yakteen horse, and I've been kind of critical because this barn doesn't often have like their workouts on XBTV, but this one happens to have one of those works on there, which is back on December 17th, and maybe just because a Phil D'Amato horse happened to be kind of caught up in that move. But they weren't really asking the horse for the best that day. Now, as far as Tim Yakteen, he sent out 2 first-time starters this meet, and both these horses are worth a mention because on January 20th, he sent out a maiden claiming horse. It was a maiden 62.50, which was pretty similar to today. A horse called Foolish. Broke slow and then made a burst, finished second. You don't really see maiden claiming horses make a burst. That horse probably should have won if not for kind of that start. And then the other horse was back on January 2nd, a horse called Song of Shadows, which drew post 11, another horse that was wide, up close to a very fast pace. So finished off the board, but really, given the race scenario, didn't have a chance. But at least that's showing me that they're sending out horses that are somewhat live, and being that new face in this group, one I'm going to definitely use as well.
You brought up all horses that I was going to ask you about, so you took care of that. As for the 2 Mark Glatt runners, I had similar notes on them. Street Mogul, I was maybe a little bit more favorable towards than you are. I would probably flip-flop him a little bit, though I agree. he does look like a smaller, cheaper sort of horse. What I liked about the last workout I saw is that he had to be asked early, but he was really staying on well at the end, and he feels to me, even though he's a horse that's smaller in stature, like one that really is going to benefit from added distance. He's just kind of that steady horse that keeps on running. So I think we're going to see better from him here. He actually was staying on better than it might look in that turf race. The winner won by nearly 10 lengths, and the field was kind of stopping at the end, and he was one of the few horses that actually ran through the wire that day, and feels like he might be more of a dirt type. So I expect better from him, but I don't know if he's going to be quite good enough to win here. I love the notes that you gave about the Tim Yakteen firster. That was a horse that I wasn't really sure what to do with. I didn't love that workout that I saw, but like you said, it was a month and a half ago. Seems like he's kind of maybe picked it up since then in his workouts. We haven't seen those. So he's definitely a horse that seems a little bit interesting. And just to wrap it up, if I was going to use one horse out of that January 6th race won by Noel Arbor, it would not be Big Hat Willie, who has that fake trouble line last time. It would be the number 8 Motorcade, who is a second-time starter who broke slowly, rushed up into the race, was still finishing at the end. John Sadler does pretty well with the second-time starters, so he's the one out of that race that I would want to include on my tickets.
Yeah, I agree with you there. He's also kind of like just sneaking in, right? Being that $150,000 purchase. Like, just sneaking in.
All right, let's move on to the next race in this sequence, race 8, another maiden special weight event. This one is for the 3-year-olds going a mile and an eighth on the turf course. And we've got another pretty wide open race here. We have a field of 11 runners signed on. I would imagine the horse that could take money comprise the number 1 San Antone, the number 2 Escape Artist potentially, and also the number 11 Eastbound, whose connections had been toying with running him in the Robert B. Lewis. I know he was one of those 2 non-Baffert trainees that was actually nominated to the race, but they're going to run in this maiden turf event instead. Unfortunately, they drew the far outside post position. Emily, this is another race where it's a little bit hard to read the pace situation.
Yeah. And again, and sometimes it's like, it's because it's so hard to, let's not spend a lot of energy on it. Now, with that said, I think it does upgrade Escape Artist. Unfortunately, it's not going to be any creative idea because everybody's going to kind of see the same thing, but it makes that horse just tougher to leave off your tickets because at least you know the horse has early speed and he's drawn inside, and they're, those factors just kind of like, you just sort of need that type of horse in the pace scenario that is a little bit muddy. The plot likes the look of the 6 and the 11. The 6, I feel like I've seen him, and the 11 has had some trips, tends to break slow, but he's put in some good races. So the 2 and the 11 are horses that I'm going to use. Like I said, I'm a little just kind of meh on the 6. Doesn't really do anything for me. Now, I think the 9 will also show speed in here because why not? I mean, honestly, I think he has shown speed in the past, not quite on this level, but going this distance. Now, with that in mind, I like the stablemate, which is number 5, Excel Calculator. The debut to me at Los Alamitos was better than look. He broke slow. He was wide. He closed a lot of ground. It was a good gallop out. And then just from a physical standpoint, keying off that January 2nd race, just looks like a horse that's just going to run like all day long. There's nothing that when I look at him, I'm like, oh, this is a turf horse, but there's nothing that's like he can't handle the turf. So I think the added ground and having that foundation, that if there's like another forward move available, like this is the spot. And then another better than looked effort that's worth a mention on is in a better than looked effort from Maltese Falcon back on opening day, where he did have some issues in the gate. So maybe where he was a little bit reluctant to load, and then he was on hold, bottled up inside, and getting a rider change today. As you mentioned, Pratt not having the best meet, was aboard last out. Dettori, on the other hand, has been riding lights out. So taking over. So we could see a little bit more tactical speed today. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, I'll kind of key off you. I mean, this is one of those races where you could talk about every single horse and find something interesting to say about them. And you covered a lot of the field. I'll touch upon some of the ones you mentioned, give a few more that I'm interested in. I would say if I had to pick the horse that I think is the most talented in this field, it's probably the number 11 eastbound. That one turf race, he was never inside, was trying to run against the race flow to make up ground into the gate to wire winner, and was actually really finishing at the end. Even though they've run him on dirt twice, I think he is a turf horse. I just worry with Victor Espinoza aboard, breaking from post 11. Doesn't he have another wide trip coming to him? It just feels like this is the kind of jockey that's probably going to sit 3 wide and be content to do so around both turns. And I'm not sure that's going to be the winning trip in this race because there's not that much speed signed on, and he feels like a horse that isn't the quickest in the early stages, so he's going to need a little bit of racing luck. As for the 2 Escape Artist, as you said, the horse that might benefit most from the projected race flow, it's a weird race, the one he comes out of. When I'm looking at the TimeformUS pace figures, it's the rare race where the fractions are color-coded both red and blue, indicating that parts of the race were fast, parts of it were slow. The first quarter was fast. They really slowed it down in the middle portions of that race, and I think that benefited Escape Artist that he was able to get that big breather, because he did kick on pretty gamely at the end, but he also saved all the ground in doing so, and getting that mid-race break that allowed him to accelerate towards the final quarter mile of the race. So I wasn't totally convinced on him, but he is one that I'm definitely afraid of in this race. The horse that I kind of wanted to downgrade a little bit is the number 1 San Antone, who figures like a horse that could take money. Phil D'Amato, Flavien Prat in his corner. This horse did close last time, but I thought he got a fantastic ride and trip from Prat, saved ground, was able to slip through inside, whereas the number 6 Single Track Mind, who was also trying to make ground from the back of the pack, he came off the rail at the quarter pole. San Antone cut the corner inside of him and looked like he should have had the race won and just didn't quite seal the deal in the final eighth of a mile. So I'm a little bit skeptical of him. Those are the kinds of horses that I want to see win off those trips, and he didn't get it done. So as one that could take money again, I wanted to kind of go against him. And kind of like in the race that we were just talking about, you have a few horses, I think 5 in total, coming out of that December 30th race where San Antone was second. And when I go back and watch that race, the horse that interested me most out of there is the number 10 Genius Jimmy, who is another runner for the Michael McCarthy barn. And when I go back to this horse's turf debut 2-back, he really did have a trip that day. Saved ground early, but just had nowhere to go in the stretch. Juan Hernandez was trying to ankle him out and just could never really get into the clear. Finally found sort of a little bit of a seam in the last 16th, but he'd already given up at that point, so just kind of eased that horse to the wire. And then last time out, I feel like he underestimated what he had. He was a little bit wide early, ended up getting spun out a little bit at the quarter pole, and just kind of lacked the urgency to really get this horse motivated. And once he finally set him down at the 8th pole, this horse was really running through the wire and quickly passing horses, and I feel like he missed the opportunity to get him more involved in the race earlier. Now they're putting the blinkers on. This is a horse that's actually broken well in his starts, and I think he's one that could be a little bit more forward from this outside post position, and maybe Michael McCarthy will be looking to control this race on the front end with Escape Artist, who's likely to lead, and sending forward Genius Jimmy. And I just think he's a horse that is better than he looks on paper and seems ripe to take a big step forward here.
Yeah, I mean, no knocks. You bring up good points, and I looked at him because he has forward progression in each of those starts, which is like what you want to see with lightly raced types. You know, as far as optics grade, it's like C on debut, then he runs a C plus, and then he runs a B minus next out. It's like he's moving forward with each race, and I have a hard time knocking that. And I'm in complete agreement with you as far as San Antone. It's not a horse I want. My note for that race was shorter, so the fact that they're going to come back going longer and at a short price, I'm pretty negative on. And I guess the other McCarthy horse was fine at Golden Gate Fields, a little bit against the flow, but that's just such a much softer circuit and race altogether.
Yeah, and before I move on, I'll just touch upon the 2 other horses you mentioned that I didn't already react to. I agree, Maltese Falcon, definite contender in this race, kind of against that weird mid-race flow last time where they really slowed down in the middle of the race. And Excel Calculator, I agree. I like this horse. I get the feeling he might be one of these dirt marathoners. As the progeny of Cairo Prince, I like to look for them to have that big bouncy stride when they're going to move to the turf. And he doesn't really have that. As you said, he kind of has that like steady action. I think he's going to be coming at the end. I wonder if he's really a turf move up horse. We'll see. The pedigree can kind of go either way with him.
Yeah, like I said, I wasn't like loving him for turf, but no knocks either. So just kind of in a crazy race is what I'm using.
Well, I think the race that we can spend the least amount of time on is the Santa Monica, which is up next. It's the grade 2 on this card, going 7 furlongs for the fillies and mares. I mean, Bob Baffert's dangerous in these situations. It seems like he's got the number 2, Fun to Dream, in strong form right now. Did you see a reason why Awake at Midnight is supposed to reverse the result from the La Brea, or do you just view these as the 2 best horses in the race, and Fun to Dream might have her measure again?
Yeah, I mean, Fun to Dream is just really good. She's very solid. I mean, she's fast. She has tactical speed. She knows how to win races. You know, all those things. As far as Awake at Midnight, she's also good. But if you really start to dig into her races where she's good in the sense that she's like hitting the border winning, she's having looking at optics, she's having races that either has like a fire contention or a high speed rate. And today's race is, and granted, it's a red plot fit, it's a little bit all over the place, but it's a snowflake with 0 speed rate. So it's like, this isn't this type of scenario where Awake at Midnight has been shown to excel in the past. Is she, as far as the pace scenario? So like, Fun to Dream just seems like a legitimate favorite in here. The other crazy idea I have, like probably a horse I'm going to single, and like the way that I'm kind of like structuring, which I haven't quite decided yet, but seems like, I don't know, some tickets kind of makes the most sense. But I'm going to use Anna Kappa as like a backup to some extent at a price, because she's shown that she can run fast. She shows she can show speed. She has that inside draw. And then coming out of the Los Flores, which is the common race with Lady T, where that race really set up for Lady T. This race not so much, but Anna Kappa just didn't have the right ride at all. She like dropped back early. They started to run on late, so the fact they're going to come back with a rider change today, kind of come right back and come back in graded stakes company again. Just think there's more for her to show. And she's run well. So it's like, is she as good as Fun to Dream? That remains to be seen by quite a lot. But at least she's like, if I'm looking at kind of, well, what if Fun to Dream just doesn't have her day? One I'm going to use as well.
No, you make some good points about Anna Kappa, and she's probably a horse that I overlooked a little bit. I kind of just saw that she's been beaten by so many of the runners that she's facing here, and kind of assessed her as a cut below and wasn't really considering her as a prime candidate to win the race. But you make a valid point about her trip last time, and it's not like her prior form makes her totally impossible in here, because the reality of Fun to Dream is that her La Brea was a class above these, but her prior form, it doesn't make her some huge standout in here, and they certainly bet her in the La Brea like they knew she was going to take a big step forward, so maybe this is just the horse that she is now, and we're supposed to assume that she's going to run back to that speed figure. Certainly the works that I've seen since then suggest that she will, because it seems like she's been doing very well since that race, and she's very much the most likely winner, but I do have a little bit of a problem getting too overconfident with these one-fig horses that you're trusting to run back to it at a very short price.
Yeah, for sure. The other thing I'll mention here is, just because if people look at optics and they'll be like, well, what? How do you not mention the 4? Because on surface and distance, the 4 looks like she has a clear pace advantage. But again, as I mentioned, the red plot fit, and really what that's keying off of is that September 11th race at Del Mar, where the track profile played to her favor. So that's why I kind of downgraded her off that surface distance. She's lacked a finish in her 2 races. But yeah, I mean, Fun to Dream. Optics doesn't have her numbers as the La Brea that much higher than what she was running before. So I don't know if it looks different on time form, but that La Brea, as far as Fun to Dream, she recorded a 96 optics figure, and then she ran a 95 in that October 1st allowance race. So, and then a 94 in the Betty Grable. So, I mean, it looks like she's kind of still running in that same area to me. That race doesn't look as much of an outlier as maybe you guys have it.
Yeah, Beyer and Timeform have it a huge step forward for her. I think that
okay.
8 points on Beyer, and Craig has it 11 points higher than her prior best. And albeit that Malibu day when they ran the La Brea was a difficult day to be sure about the speed figures because her final time was very close to the final time that Taba ran winning the Malibu, and I think speed figures had to make the decision whether or not you group those two races together because it did seem going in like it was far-fetched that the La Brea horses would run as fast as Taba winning the Malibu. So I understand if, you break those out or not, but getting away from being in the weeds about speed figures, Fun to Dream just is very much the one to beat. I agree that she just seems like she has Awake at Midnight's number right now, so I do prefer her. I was trying to make a case for Lady T, but as you said, she had the race flow in her favor last time. She's just kind of one of these weird horses with a really high head carriage. She's not the prettiest to watch run, and it doesn't feel like she's going to get that same setup in here, so I ended up downgrading her a little bit, even though I was trying to make that case, and I like what you were saying about the number 1 Anna Kappa. She's one that I'll probably throw on some backup tickets on your say-so. Let's move on to the final leg of this sequence, the Grade 3 Thunder Road, this one going a mile on the turf for the older horses. We've got a large field signed on, 12 runners. A lot to go through in this race. We've got plenty of back class. I think layoffs are a real theme in here because while there aren't a bunch of horses coming off layoffs, there are some horses that once were among the best in the California Turf Division that have these big year-long gaps in their past performances. And I think you have to just decide who you think is still capable of running the kind of race that's going to be capable of winning this.
Yeah, I'm going to go in that direction again. It's like in these type of situations, you have to have a little bit of YOLO, a little bit of like creativity and outside the box, but also sort of like, okay, I have a plan, and I'm gonna separate, these two, and like to me, class, I just kind of give that edge, and so I'm going that way. So I assume you're kind of leading up with like Du Jour and Hit the Road, and starting with Du Jour, which is, such an unconventional horse altogether because it's a Baffert turf horse, which you don't see, but this horse is so good. This horse is so good. There's just like, the Kentucky Downs race, not great, but it was a yielding course. There was a layoff that followed. The layoff that followed the Mathis Mile, which is a race that they had planned to run on the turf. But other than that, I mean, you don't see horses from California transferring form east and being competitive. Now, I know people look at finishing positions and they'll see he didn't win either of those races, but those were very good efforts. And just watching this horse off the layoff and watching him, it's like he travels so effortlessly. He looks like he still wants to run. So it's like, I love that they're bringing this horse back. He's a gelding now, so it's like they're going to race him. They're picking this spot, which is a graded stakes race. He has the class. He has the speed. He's got a good kind of tactical running style. Good record over this course. There's things to like, and people probably gravitate, away from him because, Pratt ended up on Earl's Rock. Now, Earl's Rock is fine. He has the benefit of recency. Maybe he falls into a trip because that's what he's been able to do this far. But those 3 wins, he's had everything his own way. And so, yes, maybe he draws up another perfect trip, but I think the fact that, Pratt going away from Du Jour will help his price if those other factors don't already do it.
Yeah, I was kind of teeing up Du Jour there, and I had a feeling you might like this horse too. Yeah, for all the reasons you said. I mean, I remember going back to watch this horse's California races before he ran that American turf, and I noted the same thing that you. He's just got this beautiful way of moving, and I did wonder about his class at that time, and clearly he passed that test when he won the American turf all the way back in 2021. It's kind of crazy to think. I think that was the Medina Spirit Derby day. Feels like forever ago. But
Absolutely.
But Du Jour, I mean, he held his form pretty well through the summer for Belmont in both that Belmont Derby and Saratoga Derby. I'm not even convinced, even though he's a son of Temple City, that those 1.25 mile distances really suited him. I like him coming back at the mile here. And as you said, I watched those recent workouts too on the training track. just that lengthy floating stride was still in evidence, and I think he's going to run well here. He's got the inside post, he's got technical speed, and I know Baffert doesn't have a record of doing well off layouts with turf horses. Most of them in the samples that I looked at are not of the class of a horse like De Jour, so I think that the stats probably, I wouldn't harp on them too much for this particular horse. And speaking of trips, there are two horses that I would want to downgrade off getting a series of perfect trips. You mentioned one of them, Earl's Rock, who I know too, back off the layoff, he was a little keen. All in all, I thought he got a pretty good trip that day and just didn't really finish. And then last time, got the jump on his main rival Lincoln Hawk and still barely won that race. This is a step up in class for him, and he still has some things to prove to me for connections that are likely to take money. And the other horse that I want to downgrade off recent trips is the number 8 Air Force Red, who maybe he's just in great form now, and maybe he's suddenly become the best turf miler in California, who's got that versatility where he can also sprint. But to me, watching his last two races, it does feel like he was the beneficiary of some very favorable circumstances. The pace was pretty slow too back when he won the Lure, and he was just able to sprint home. And then last time out, I mean, that was just kind of a joke in the Hernandez. There were horses that seemingly could have pressed him, and they just let him get away with a very soft opening quarter for that distance, and he basically just sprinted home 4 furlongs after that, and nobody had a chance to catch him. So he's good, but he's kind of an all or nothing type. And if somebody decides to go after him on the front end just a little bit, he's the kind of horse that could throw in the towel. So I wanted to go against him as the horse that I think might go favored in here.
Wow. Yeah, I'm against him. Well, I would be surprised if maybe he is. Yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe they do kind of gravitate towards him as being kind of the now horse. But yeah, I mean, you brought up the reasons. Like, he's had those lone trips and he's had those soft paces. This is a tougher spot. There's horses in here that are going to press him, that he's going to get more pace pressure. All those factors that it's a horse that I've always liked, but not like today.
Who else are you looking at in here aside from De Jour? Because as you said, there are some other runners with back class. I know you brought up Hit the Road. Personally, yes, I'm a little more iffy on him. I wish he had done a bit more running last time in that turf sprint. It does feel like he's kind of working his way back, but I wonder if he's had enough, if today is the day, if too much time has passed. I had trouble making up my mind about him.
Yeah, I mean, it is. You did want to see a little bit more, and I thought he was going to run a lot better than he did. I really didn't mind the distance. I didn't mind, the layoff, like watching him train. He seemed, and the figure, came back fine. As you mentioned, just sort of the way the race shape played out. Now, Kimura's going to get aboard, and Kimura's riding just incredible. I mean, he's, came down from Woodbine where he's crushed up there, and he's done just as well here. So maybe that's it. Maybe they just need the race. He's going to get back to a mile where he's been impressive in the past. So seeing kind of those changes, at least to me, it's showing like intent and coming back in a spot on relative short rest, all things considered, because you kind of go through his history. He does have those layoff lines. So at least that's showing me like, well, they were obviously expecting a little bit more as well. And, outside of that, those races in his past like make him a fit. So I'm going to use him, and maybe the fact that he will end up being some value to compensate because people kind of shying away from him, and especially if horses like Air Force Red end up taking a lot of money. I could see number 10 Dark Shift also taking money as kind of being this new face, but that race was like, I've never heard of any of those horses. I know that I'm being a little shady by saying that because I've looked up the form and I do know those horses. But he's not beating much is what I'm trying to say. He wasn't running against much out at Keeneland. He's another horse that's coming off a layoff. Now, a bit of a wild card opinion in here is the number 12 Cowboy Spirit. Maybe he's kind of a cut below, but he's a horse that he can kind of show up with a good effort from time to time. Maybe the intention is there. There's a couple things to like as far as the plot in terms of race shape. So one that, be a little bit deeper on some tickets, but yeah, that's kind of we see it pretty much, I guess, kind of similar, at least on those horses we've discussed.
Yeah, I'll just touch upon one that you mentioned and then one more that we haven't talked about yet. Dark Shift, I I don't know what to do with him. I probably will end up using him in this race because his form overseas was actually pretty good. He was one of these handicap horses that was really getting good in the middle of the summer. He won that crazy Royal Hunt Cup that they run at Ascot that always has 25 or maybe sometimes even up to 40 horses in it. And he beat 28 rivals that day, came back with another good effort. He was a horse that they had brought over to Keeneland to run in that Grade 1 Keeneland Turf Mile, which Annapolis ended up winning, I believe. I think he was stuck on the also eligible list that day, and they ended up instead running in the allowance race. And to me, he just never really had a chance to get into that race. It was mostly dominated towards the front end. He broke slowly, as the first-time shippers tend to do. His rider just kind of put him at the back of the pack. Never really got him out into the clear to make a run. Was just kind of running through the pack, but running through the wire. And he just feels like a horse to me that got that prep in. And it was a little while ago. He's coming off another little bit of a layoff, but I think he's better than that. So I expect him to run a stronger race in here. I still wonder if a mile at California with a wide post is still going to be his cup of tea because he is a horse that needs things to come back to him a little bit. But I think he's better than that race at Keeneland might suggest. And the other horse that I want to bring up, who I really think could slip through the cracks here at a big price, is the number 4 Bob and Jackie, who once was one of the better turf horses in California. I know that he's now a 7-year-old, and there have been, a couple seasons in there where things haven't quite gone according to plan. He's coming off a trainer switch away from Richard Baltus, who of course isn't training anymore right now, now in George Papadrodou's barn. But his last race, to me, it wasn't that bad. He was coming off the layoff, going 9 furlongs. I know they've tried to make this horse go longer a number of times. I've always thought he's much better at the flat mile distance, and I think the fact that they've tried to go longer with him a lot in the past year or two has kind of obscured his good form a little bit. And the start of that last race was just totally chaotic. I mean, they were starting on the dirt course for the 1.125 distance, and I mean, he veered in so severely, he kind of knocked himself off balance as a horse to his inside didn't break well. I mean, it was just like bumper cars at the start of that race, and I'm willing to give him that excuse and the fact he was coming off the layoff. He got a ridiculous trip in the Kilrow prior to the layoff. I just think he's a horse that when you start to pick through his races, it doesn't look like his good form is as far gone as it might seem at first glance. And he's not going to take money with, this rider on board and, the form that's showing. So he's one that I definitely want to use here at a big price.
Yeah, I'm probably being a little bit more critical on some horses, and this kind of being one because I look at his races that he has won, and they're sort of the way I sort of see Earl's Rock, where he's had some perfect trips. Now he has maybe shown obviously more class because he's been a little bit more consistent on that front, has run it in some tough spots and maybe at distances that aren't great. And I agree with you as far as the start wasn't good. He was washed out that day, which isn't always a positive for this individual. He has been warm in the past and hasn't run well when he's been warm, according to my notes. And I was probably being maybe a little bit too harsh on the 10. And as far as the layoff, it's a little bit different than the horse that's earlier on in the card, because at least for this horse, he's showing a gap in his works in November. So you could take that kind of time to be like, okay, well, maybe they had to get kind of something sorted out a little bit. And now he's been working consistently up to this race. They did wear front wraps last out, and I just don't know this individual all around, but maybe that's something of a positive to look for on the track, that maybe a removal is a sign of use. I guess you can make the kind of against the flow excuse as well. So yeah, maybe I'm being a little bit harsher than I should be.
Yeah, I think we covered that race pretty well. It's the kind of race, unlike a few that we talked about earlier, where it seems wide open at first glance, but when I actually got down to it, there weren't that many horses that I really wanted. So that helps a lot when you're trying to construct the ticket in this sequence, to know that there are some short prices that you just want to leave off. So to wrap things up with regard to the Santa Anita sequence, Emily, how are you looking at potentially constructing a ticket? I know you probably haven't done all of the, the thinking that goes into that just yet, but how are you kind of coming at that problem just based on the conversation we've had?
Again, I think there's just a couple horses that will be short prices that don't necessarily stand out. Maybe talking about race 1 in particular with number 10, Carmen Miranda. trying to zig and zag in there. Race two, using a spread, but some of the horses that aren't from that common race, maybe with the Sadler horse as the exception. As far as the third leg, race eight, that main special weight race, upgrading some of those horses, downgrading maybe some of those other shorter priced horses in that event. Still a little bit of a spread. As far as the ninth race, feeling that the two, Fun to Dream, is a legitimate favorite, and then some long shot use on the one. And then as far as, race 10, there's probably going to be a scenario where some tickets are single to the two, which sounds so crazy when it's like a layoff horse. But when you have sort of these horses that's like, they're probably either going to win or run out, it's like that's sort of how you kind of have to just use them. And then, using some of those other horses that we discussed as well in the case that, it is the layoff that kind of is the undoing there. But yeah, it's hard because we don't have the morning lines yet and things like that. So, but that's sort of like my kind of initial strategy.
Yeah, as far as structure goes, I think we're going to be a little bit similar here, maybe just using some different horses along the way. I'm going to probably go thicker in the first couple of legs. Those were the tougher ones to narrow down for me. I agree, I'm also somewhat against Carmen Miranda, but I'd want to use a bunch of horses like the number 1, Ready, Jet, Go, the number 4, Annie's Song, the 5, Rivendell, the 8, Pearl Glory, and Emily made a good case for Rebel Girl as well. So, I mean, those are all horses that I want to have somewhere on my ticket. Trying to beat that likely favorite in the first leg. I do like Arrow the Great in the 7th race, but wouldn't want to lean too heavily on him. Also think the 9 Bluegrass Go-Go has a big shot. I would use a little bit of Street Mogul as well as Motorcade, who I both think have some upside off their career debuts. Moving on to the 8th race, I really like that 10 horse, Genius Jimmy. He just seems like one that is a little bit underrated coming in here, is going to be a fair price. So I would use him along with the 2 Escape Artists and the 4 Maltese Falcon. I have to decide what price I think Eastbound is going to be because I think he's talented. I'm just not sure that this is the right situation for him. So I'll see how hefty this ticket price comes up about whether or not he's a horse that I want to use. Fun to Dream is a horse I'm going to lean on, like Emily. She just seems like very much the most likely winner of this race. And I did not have a strong alternative that really enticed me, although I will throw in Anna Kappa on some smaller backup tickets. And then in the last leg, the Thunder Road, I'm most interested in Du Jour. I like the price on Bob and Jackie, and I think he's got a little bit of upside. And I would also use the 10 Dark Shift, but there are a lot of horses that I just am not interested in using at what I think will be relatively short prices in this race. So I'm going to try to go as thinly as I can in this Thunder Road because hopefully I was able to beat some favorites by casting a wider net earlier.
Yeah, and I mean, just talking this out, and just in general, just as far as players, it's a sequence to look at. It should pay well. You know, use our opinions, go against them, whatever. Like it's just one of those that, like, at least you're looking at it and considering because it looks like one that's a playable sequence that if you're a little bit creative and a little bit lucky, you're going to get rewarded.
Now, Emily, I'm sorry we've gone over an hour. I know I promised you plenty of time to give your thoughts on the Robert B. Lewis. I mean, there's so much to talk about in that race. But jesting aside, did you have any opinions on the Derby preps this weekend? Just, because I know people are interested in those races.
Yeah, so I wrote up the Holy Bowl. We'll be talking about that on the Hawthorne live stream. So if you kind of follow those 2 spots, just to, like in the interest of time. I mean, as far as the Robert B. Lewis, it's obviously not a race I'm interested in betting at all. It's a 4-horse field. Some people brought up some good points online. It's like, how do you know what the connections are going to do? In that race, I think it's going to be more of an interesting race of what you end up do with those horses going forward. It's so weird too because I go through like all these notes and like so every note is like finish second to a stablemate. Bob Baffert finished 1, 2, 3 in this race, and it's like, well, he's going to finish 1, 2, 3, 4 in here. So I'm not. There's just no strong opinion in this race. It's not a race I'm playing, and then I'm going to assess those horses pretty much going forward. And then I think the only other race that day is the Withers, right?
The Withers, yeah, in addition to the Holy Bull, yep.
Yeah, a race that I kind of looked at fairly quick, But my idea in there is to go with Hit Show, a horse that was scratched out of the Southwest, who I thought had a little bit of a look at the Southwest. And the Southwest is probably a tougher race than this, but just from like a pace scenario, it just looks like there's a lot of contention from the 1, 3, 4, 6, and even maybe the 2 kind of can be stalking a little bit just kind of based on the distance. And so Hit Show just might fall in the right place and time. And then Hit Show as an individual, going back to last week in the Southwest, pointing out that of the Brad Cox runners, which he did have 3, ended up running 2 with Hit Show scratching, a horse that's moved forward in each start. And as I mentioned, we did the Santa Anita races. I like that for younger horses. I like to see that development race to race, not just in speed figures, but how they're holding their own against the competition. So I'm going to kind of lean in that direction.
Yeah, they're definitely not the most interesting handicapping races with a wealth of options this weekend. The Holy Bull looks like the kind of race where the 2 favorites do seem pretty strong, at least to me. I've been a little bit of a fan of Rocket Can, but yeah, I agree about Hit Show and the Withers. He is a horse that seems like he's going to appreciate that 9 furlongs and has that upward trajectory with his form. So definitely one that seems interesting, and I have a feeling he's going to be a relatively short price. I don't know exactly how they're going to bet that race, how much respect Arctic Arrogance is going to command, but it does feel like he's a horse that really is going to get the right kind of race flow in that race at Aqueduct on Saturday. Well, Emily, I don't want to take up any more of your time, but I really appreciate you coming on. I always enjoy talking about these races with you, and hopefully we gave out some good ideas for the Santa Anita sequence on Saturday.
Yeah, that was fun. I hope people listen. Always enjoy talking with you and talking horse racing.
Well, everybody, thanks to Emily, and also thanks to you for listening this week. Remember that you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Everybody, again, thanks for tuning into the podcast this week. Hopefully, Craig will be back next Tuesday when we do the Timeform US Pacecast, so make sure to tune into that.